Have you ever wondered what makes a painting stand out and captivate its audience? Today, I'm going to reveal the secrets behind one of my most popular paintings. You'll see step by step how to recreate this, showstopper of a painting and learn the techniques that make it so engaging. Whether you're striving to loosen up your portraiture or enhance your realism, keep watching because I have a lot to share with you. For those of you who are new here, my name is Chelsea and I help passionate oil painters like you loosen up your style without sacrificing the realism and bold brushwork that make portraiture so captivating. If you love the works of John Singer Sargent and Richard Schmid, you're in the right place. Today's video is all about recreating a fan favorite painting of mine from scratch. So let's get started. By the way, if you're an experienced portrait painter serious about reaching that next level, I'm here to help. I have a free masterclass linked down in the description that takes the concepts that I described today and then turns them into a long-term plan to help you reach your goals for expressive painterly realism. So today, I'm going to be kicking off with part one of a two-part series to make sure that I can walk you through the entire start to finish process of creating this piece without glossing over anything important. Let's start by picking up where I left off with last week's video on how to better plan your paintings. If you're a regular viewer of mine, today's painting may look familiar because last week's video really was a necessary first step to making this video possible. That is, in order to create a painting like this one, I had to start with a bulletproof plan. And in this case, a fantastic plan means a fantastic reference. Last week, I walked you through step by step how I went from idea to photo shoot to having an edited photo to get things started. And the idea behind that video was a pretty straightforward one. You probably aren't planning your paintings enough to create the kinds of paintings you want to make. I know some people will push back on that idea, but having talked with thousands of painters to find out where they're getting stuck, one of the biggest sticking points is that they are just painting from convenient reference, rather than the specific kind of reference that will help them to make the exact paintings they want. And this was true even for me. After last week's video, I took my plan a step further to mock up several compositional options. I slept on it, I tinkered with them some more. I photoshopped in different arm positions and facial expressions from other photos from that same photo shoot until I thought the pose was a bit more aesthetic. I played with the background. I experimented with adding more abstraction until finally I arrived at a mock-up that I was 100% satisfied with. Which actually brings me to a question from one of my students, Kitty. So I let my students have a sneak peek of this painting and ask me anything they wanted about the process of creating it. So Kitty asked if I was going to plan on leaving this background loose. After completing this mock-up exercise, I knew the answer would be yes. See, this step for me is a critical way to take the leap from feeling stuck copying exactly what you see to painting in your voice and adding your unique twist on a composition. I'm able to get the best of both worlds this way. I can come up with a plan that does put my unique spin on the composition that aligns with my creative voice. But it's also a plan where once the plan is all set, I can just copy it. So when I'm at the easel, I don't have to worry about whether she would have looked better in a different pose or wearing a different dress, or whether I should have made that mark more abstractly. I can just focus on putting the marks down and creating the texture I want. So after finishing the mock-up, I realized that I would actually plan on intentionally leaving the painting looking unfinished. And I would do that through abstract brushwork in the background specifically. This is exactly what this mock-up process allows me to visualize and double check so that I'm not second guessing anything down the line. But with loose brushwork does come a lot of questions, like this one from Kasha, who asked, how considerate are you about the direction, strength, and character of the marks here? Is there a planning process regarding your mark making taking place in advance? 100%. In fact, this brings me to the next step in this process, which was to figure out what the ideal order of operations was for blocking in the painting. This is a big painting. I knew it would be too involved to finish in one sitting, but I knew I wanted an alla prima looking wet into wet approach. Think about Sargent's big paintings, for instance. You couldn't do them in one day, but they certainly have a very wet feeling, a very alla prima feeling. So I had to essentially break this painting down into stages where I would work one section to completion and then let it dry while beginning on the next section. In my case, this meant that I needed to tackle the background first. This isn't the most fun part of the painting for me, the faces. So it usually wouldn't be that tempting to dive into the background at the beginning. But in my case, I knew that I wanted this transparent oxide brown wash. And I knew that transparent paints work best early in the painting when they're thinned with Gamsol. That means that in order to preserve fat over lean, I had to put down the transparency near the beginning of the painting process. If I put it in later, I would either be using the wrong medium to get the effect I wanted, or I would risk the transparent paint mixing with opaque paint, which would make for a cloudy, chalky, muddy, opaque mess. Which brings me to an important detail of creating this painting: my materials. So I'm gonna go ahead and scooch over here so you can see a little bit better what my palette looks like behind me. Don't worry if you can't see these individual piles, they are a mess anyway. So to make this painting, I used my standard studio portrait palette. I have titanium white, yellow ochre, terra rosa, transparent oxide red, transparent oxide brown, permanent rose, viridian, ultramarine blue, and then finally my medium here, which has kind of all but disappeared, is Rublev's Oleo Gel, and then my solvent for this painting was Gamsol. For brushes, I primarily used rosemary long filberts and some flats in the ivory and evergreen lines, as well as some Creative Mark Qualita flats in larger sizes to help me get down big brush strokes in the beginning stages. I also had some rosemary soft fan brushes for knocking down texture and glare on the canvas, and an occasional Master's Choice filbert to create softer, more natural brush strokes. But I'll be honest, I don't think the choice between the Master's Choice and the other rosemary brushes made for a big difference in this particular painting. So just to give you a visual, here's what some of these brushes look like. The orange handled brush is the Creative Mark Qualita. The white brush is a rosemary ivory filbert. The green brush is the rosemary evergreen filbert. And then I have a pure sable fan brush from Rosemary here. Most of my brushes looked something like this for this process. Now, with that out of the way, let's dive into the painting. My first steps on the canvas itself were to, one, wet the whole thing down with a very translucent wash of paint just to tint the white of the canvas, and then very lightly indicate where the major shapes of light and dark would be, double checking my drawing before going in any darker, and then finally starting to lay down the big brown abstract brush strokes that you see in the background of the painting in my plan. Then, that initial wash was a combination of transparent oxide brown, ultramarine, and viridian, and maybe occasionally a touch of permanent rose. The big abstract brush marks are actually the same, just with the transparent oxide brown as the most dominant color. But you may notice moments where you see more ultramarine or viridian, or maybe even places with more of a transparent oxide red cast to them. I'm not gonna lie, this took a lot of time to get right. To answer a question from my student Ruth about how I knew what kinds of marks to make and where, I wound up tinkering with these marks bit by bit throughout the painting. But if at all possible, I knew that I would try and get them right as early as I could, simply by following my plan here. If a mark was loose, I would keep it loose. If the mark was tight, I'd keep it tight. Same thing with hard and soft edges. Thinking through this really thoughtfully and diving into this section of the painting first, it really removed the risk that I would create some perfect, painstaking portrait and then just go and mess it all up with bad abstract brushwork at the end. I would much rather realize that I have messed up in the early stages before I put in a ton of hours rather than the opposite. So to aid in this process, I backed up a lot. So to answer Trish's question here, I didn't back up as much as I could have because my studio setup was a little bit of an issue at a distance. I was seeing some glare when I was far away from the painting. But I did pause to check my drawing and ensure that as I went through this step, I let some of my darker block in depict not just the background brushwork, but I also let it drift into the darker shapes within the chair and the figure. Throughout the creation of this painting, I probably wouldn't go longer than 30 minutes without pausing to recheck all of these areas and make sure that everything was on track, especially with regard to the drawing. But because I worked standing, I would back up way more frequently than that. In a perfect world and in a perfect studio space, I probably would have backed up before making every mark. But hey, live and learn. So in these early stages of the painting, I've been using Gamsol as my only way to thin the paint. In the first wash, it was mostly Gamsol, just to tint the canvas and kill the white of it, so to speak. Then, to put in the abstract background brushwork, I was still thinning with Gamsol, but a bit less, so that the marks wouldn't start running down the canvas, but they still had some beautiful translucency and luminosity that the transparent oxide pigments are known for. You can really observe some of this up in this corner, or maybe down here. Similarly, as I progress into my first layer of color on the figure, I'm using Gamsol because I know this painting will take place over a number of sessions with multiple layers, and I don't want issues with multiple layers of paint drying at the wrong rates. Basically, this is a fat over lean problem, in case you're familiar with it. So Gamsol is used until the canvas is sufficiently covered with paint, and then I switch to Oleogel for everything thereafter. At about this time, I'm considering my block-in mostly established. I can finally start to see a figure emerging from the brushwork, even in the crude form. Now, all I'm really doing here is attempting to refine those big abstract shapes that make up the figure in the chair, going from very big, vague shapes down to small, accurate shapes without disturbing the background brushwork that I so painstakingly put in the beginning. I think this would probably be a good time to reflect on a great question from my student Emily, who wanted to know how I managed my mindset this whole time to avoid comparing this painting to the earlier version of it that I made back in 2020. I'm not gonna lie, this was a challenge. Some passages I would find myself painting in my mind exactly the same way I did 4 years ago, and it felt like I had learned nothing, and I would begin beating myself up out of frustration. As an aside, one really helpful tool to use in a situation like this one was to actually pull out the old painting and look at it side by side and realize that even if there were places where I really wanted to push myself further and create an even more extreme difference between the two, I really had grown tremendously. There were no two places on these paintings that truly was tackled in the same way or with the same level of skill. It's also really tough to approach an old subject in a fresh way, even after time has passed. When I'm helping students with an issue like this one, I often explain that it's easier to see your own progress and growth that you've achieved on a fresh painting, but it's possible to grow on a subject that you've tackled before. It's just more of an uphill battle. So it's a place where having support or mentorship is really helpful because the mindset is just a bigger beast on projects like these. I really appreciate my students asking me such thoughtful questions. I know that all of these questions are going to really help them in their own paintings. So I want to know what questions you have for me about this painting. Let me know in the comment section, and I would love to tackle them next time as you watch me bring this painting all the way to a finish. And if this has you inspired and wanting to take your portraits to a new level, balancing realism and looseness, don't forget to check out the masterclass link in the description. All right, until then, happy painting.
Let's hope that worked.